My name is Clara Sterling. I'm 32 years old. My mother-in-law changed the locks on my home while I was working a 4-hour shift, packing 6 years of my marriage into 4 black heavy-duty trash bags and leaving them on the front porch in the freezing rain. She sent me a single text message at 4:00 p.m. that read, "Julian is moving on to a life that suits his pedigree. Your services as a placeholder are no longer required. Do not trespass." She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully erased me from the Vance family history and reclaimed the historic estate I had poured my life savings into restoring. But in her haste to replace me with a woman of her choosing, Evelyn Vance forgot one crucial detail. She forgot the basement, and more importantly, she forgot what I had found buried behind the 19th century masonry down there. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you, and drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. Now, let me take you back to the spring of 2018, to a mahogany-paneled dining room in Newport, Rhode Island, and the exact moment I realized my marriage was a transaction I was destined to lose. Growing up, there were 2 distinct worlds in Newport. There was the world of the summer estates, the yacht clubs, and the trust funds that compounded faster than you could spend them. And then there was my world. My father was a general contractor. My mother was a public school teacher. I grew up with sawdust in my hair and calluses on my hands, learning how to frame a wall and read a blueprint before I could drive. I wasn't ashamed of my roots. I was proud of them. I used them to earn a full scholarship to Rhode Island School of Design, graduating at the top of my class with a master's in historical architecture and preservation. But to Evelyn Vance, none of that mattered. To Evelyn, I wasn't an architect. I was the help. Evelyn was the matriarch of the Vance family, a woman who wore her old money like a suit of armor. She was on the board of the Newport Historical Society, the Symphony, and the Hospital Foundation. Her husband, Arthur Vance, had passed away a decade prior, leaving her in total control of the family fortune and their only son, Julian. Julian was charming, handsome, and entirely spineless. When I met him, he was working at a boutique investment firm, playing the role of the independent man. He swept me off my feet with grand gestures and promises of a life built on our own terms, away from his mother's shadow. I loved him, I really did, and for a brief, blinding moment, I believed him. We got married in 2018. Evelyn didn't hide her disdain. At our rehearsal dinner, held at a country club where the waitstaff treated her like royalty, she stood up to give a toast. She didn't look at me. She looked at Julian, her wine glass raised, her diamonds catching the chandelier light. "To my son," she said, her voice dripping with that polished, patrician chill, who has always had a rebellious streak. "We all stray from the path, Julian, but a Vance always remembers where they belong eventually." She didn't mention my name once. When I brought it up to Julian that night in our hotel room, he just sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Clara, you know how she is. She just needs time to adjust. Don't make a big deal out of it." That was Julian's mantra. Don't make a big deal out of it. It was the phrase he used to excuse every slight, every insult, and every boundary his mother crossed. And I, wanting to be the supportive wife, swallowed my pride and learned to be invisible. The trap was set 6 months after our wedding. Julian and I were looking for a house to buy. I had saved $150,000 from years of consulting work and long hours at my architectural firm. I wanted a fixer-upper, something we could build together. But Evelyn had other plans. She called us to her sprawling oceanfront estate on a Sunday afternoon. "I've made a decision," Evelyn announced, pouring tea from a silver pot. "The Hawthorne house has been sitting empty since your great-aunt Margaret died. It's a disaster, structurally speaking. But since Clara here fancies herself a carpenter," she smiled, a thin, bloodless line, "I am gifting you the property. You can live there rent-free. Consider it a wedding present." The Hawthorne house was a breathtaking, if dilapidated, 1890s Victorian mansion located on one of Newport's most coveted streets. It was an architectural dream, but my instincts screamed that nothing from Evelyn was ever free. "Evelyn, that's incredibly generous," I said cautiously, "but we'd want to buy it from you. We want to put the deed in our names." Evelyn's eyes went cold. "The deed remains in the Vance family trust, Clara. I am not handing over a historic family asset to someone who just walked through the door. You will live there. You will restore it. When the time is right, it will be transferred to Julian. That is the offer. Take it, or go buy some vinyl-sided box in the suburbs." Julian squeezed my knee under the table. "Clara, it's a multi-million-dollar property. It's an incredible opportunity. We'd be fools to say no. I looked at my husband. I saw the desperate, pleading look in his eyes. He didn't want to build a life with me. He wanted to play house in his mother's kingdom. But I loved the house. The architecture called to me in a way I couldn't ignore. I told myself that restoring it would be my masterpiece, a portfolio piece that would launch my own firm. I told myself the legalities would sort themselves out once Evelyn saw how devoted I was to preserving her family's legacy. I was so naive. Over the next 5 years, the Hawthorne House became my second job, my obsession, and my prison. I worked 50 hours a week at my firm, and every evening and weekend, I was in overalls, covered in drywall dust and plaster. I poured my entire $150,000 savings into the house. I paid for the new slate roof, the copper gutters, the foundation stabilization, and the custom millwork. I did the labor myself to stretch the budget. Julian didn't lift a finger. "I'm not exactly handy, Clara," he'd laugh, pouring himself a scotch while I was on scaffolding restoring a crown molding. "Besides, Mom says you enjoy this blue-collar stuff." Evelyn visited constantly. She never knocked. She would walk through the front door, wearing her cashmere coats, running a white-gloved finger over surfaces I hadn't yet cleaned, and pointing out flaws. "This paint color is entirely too pedestrian, Clara." My Aunt Margaret would be rolling in her grave. "Evelyn, it's historically accurate to 1,895. I pulled the pigment records from the archives," I would explain, wiping sweat from my forehead. "I don't care about your little records," she would snap. "Change it. It looks cheap, and frankly, so do you right now. Julian has a dinner with the board tonight. Please tell me you aren't going looking like a day laborer." I endured it. I endured the dinners where I was placed at the far end of the table, seated next to distant cousins who asked me if I could recommend a good plumber. I endured the family photos where Evelyn would casually step in front of me, cutting me out of the frame. I endured it because I thought Julian and I were a team, surviving her together. But then, in the summer of our 5th year of marriage, Evelyn introduced Julian to Victoria Sterling. Victoria wasn't related to me. It was a cruel coincidence of last names. Victoria's family owned half the commercial real estate in Rhode Island. She was blonde, flawlessly curated, and had never worked a day in her life. Evelyn invited Victoria to every family function. She seated her next to Julian. She would loudly compliment Victoria's pedigree, her investments, her suitability. I watched my husband, the man who had promised me the world, lean into Victoria's space, laughing at her jokes, his hand resting casually on the back of her chair. When I confronted him in the car ride home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, he gaslit me with the precision of a surgeon. "You're being paranoid, Clara. Victoria is a family friend. Mom is just networking. You're always so defensive because of your background. Stop projecting your insecurities onto me." I wasn't projecting. I was observing. The ultimate betrayal began to unfold quietly, in the spaces I was too exhausted to check. As my savings dwindled to zero, Julian started staying late at the office. There were weekend retreats with clients. There were credit card charges for restaurants I had never been to. And while Julian was busy dismantling our marriage, I was down in the basement of the Hawthorne House, dismantling a crumbling brick partition to reinforce the main load-bearing beam. That was when I found it. It was mid-October. The basement of the Hawthorne House was a sprawling, cavernous space built with thick fieldstone. I had been mapping the foundation for weeks, trying to trace a moisture issue. Behind a false wall in the old coal room, my masonry chisel struck something that wasn't stone. It was metal. I cleared the debris, my heart pounding in my chest. It was a heavy, iron-cast safe, bolted into the bedrock. It had been hidden there for decades. The dial was rusted, but not broken. I didn't tell Julian. I didn't tell anyone. For 3 weeks, I hired a retired locksmith I knew from my construction contacts, bringing him in through the side door while Julian was away on a business trip. It took him 3 days to crack the antique mechanism. When the heavy iron door finally swung open, the air inside smelled of dust and old paper. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a metal lockbox. I opened it on my basement workbench under the harsh glare of a halogen work light. Inside were stacks of original blueprints, historical photographs, and a thick manila envelope sealed with wax. The seal bore the crest of Arthur Vance Evelyn's late husband. I broke the seal. The documents were brittle, yellowed at the edges. The first page was a handwritten letter from Arthur Vance, dated 2 months before his fatal heart attack in 2008. The ink was dark, the penmanship sharp and aggressive. "To whomever finds this," the letter began, "if it is my wife Evelyn, Then you have finally destroyed my sanctuary. If it is anyone else, please read carefully. Evelyn cares only for the appearance of wealth, not the preservation of history. She has secretly drained the primary family trust to fund her vanity. To protect the Hawthorne house, the estate where my grandmother was born, I have legally severed it from the Vance family trust. I stopped breathing. The air in the basement felt suddenly thick. My hands, coated in decades of masonry dust, trembled as I turned the page. Arthur had executed a quiet, ironclad transfer. He had placed the Hawthorne house deed into a blind holding company, Hawthorne Preservation LLC. Attached to the letter were the original, notarized articles of incorporation and, incredibly, the bearer certificates for the LLC. In the state of Rhode Island, prior to the abolition of bearer shares, physical possession of these certificates equaled total ownership of the company, and the company owned the house. But Arthur had added a failsafe, a legally binding codicil drafted by an independent attorney outside of Evelyn's sphere of influence. The codicil explicitly stated that if the property fell into disrepair, any individual who demonstrably funded and executed its structural restoration out of their own personal capital would be granted equitable title, activating the transfer of the LLC's ownership to them completely. Arthur had set a trap for Evelyn. He knew she would never spend her own money to restore the house. He knew she would try to use someone else, and she had used me. I sat on a wooden crate in the freezing basement, the halogen light casting long shadows across the brickwork. I had saved every receipt. I had a meticulous, itemized ledger of the $150,000 I had sunk into the property. I had video logs, blueprints with my architectural stamps, and signed permits proving I was the sole restorer of the estate. Julian hadn't signed a single document. Evelyn hadn't contributed a single dime. Under Arthur Vance's hidden legal architecture, Evelyn didn't own the Hawthorne house. Julian didn't own it. I did. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A strange glacial calm washed over me, the kind of calm that settles in right before a demolition crew brings down a condemned building. I carefully placed the documents back into the lockbox, wrapped it in the oilcloth, and carried it out to my truck. First thing the next morning, I secured the box in a safety deposit box at a bank 2 towns over. I didn't say a word to Julian. I went back to playing the exhausted, invisible wife. I smiled at his increasingly weak excuses for coming home late. I let Evelyn run her white-gloved fingers over the freshly painted wainscoting and complain about the finish. I watched them perform their arrogance, knowing I held the detonator to their entire world. I just needed them to cross the point of no return. I didn't have to wait long. November arrived, bringing with it a bitter, coastal freeze that turned the Rhode Island rain into sharp sheets of ice. My firm was pushing a major commercial project ahead of the holidays, and I volunteered to oversee the foundation pour. It was a brutal, 4-hour shift. I stood in the freezing mud from 5 a.m. until 7 p.m., my boots soaked, my muscles aching, keeping the contractors on schedule. All I wanted was a hot shower in the custom master bathroom I had built with my own 2 hands. I pulled my truck into the driveway of the Hawthorne house just after 7:30 p.m. The grand exterior lights, the ones I had meticulously wired to highlight the Victorian cornices, were blazing, but something was wrong. Sitting on the covered front porch, directly under the glow of the gas lanterns, were 4 heavy-duty black trash bags. I put the truck in park, the engine still idling, the windshield wipers slapping back and forth. I stepped out into the freezing rain. The cold bit through my damp canvas jacket. I walked up the bluestone steps, the steps I had relevelled by hand last summer, and looked down at the bags. Through a tear in the plastic of the nearest bag, I could see the fabric of my wedding dress. Stuffed next to it were my architectural sketchbooks, their pages bent and ruined by the damp air. I reached for the heavy brass door handle. It didn't turn. The lock cylinder was bright, shiny, and brand new. My phone buzzed in my pocket. My fingers were numb as I pulled it out. It was a text message from Evelyn. Julian is moving on to a life that suits his pedigree. Your services as a placeholder are no longer required. Do not trespass. A second message arrived a moment later. This one from Julian. Clara, I'm sorry it has to be this way. Mom is right. Victoria is pregnant. It just makes sense for us to start our family in the Hawthorne estate. My lawyer will be sending divorce papers to your office on Monday. Please don't make a scene. He didn't even have the courage to call me. He let his mother change the locks, throw my life into garbage bags, and text me from the coward safety of wherever they were hiding. They had orchestrated this perfectly. They waited until I had finished the final phase of the interior restoration. I had just completed the grand staircase 2 weeks ago. The house was flawless. It was move-in ready for a new bride. The trap was sprung, and they thought they had caught me dead to rights. I stood on the porch for 3 full minutes. The rain dripped from the gutters I had soldered. I looked at the new lock. I could have kicked the door in. I knew exactly where the weak points in the framing were. I could have thrown a brick through the antique leaded glass. Instead, I laughed. It wasn't a hysterical laugh. It was a deep, quiet chuckle that rattled in my chest. They thought they were evicting a squatter. They didn't realize they had just committed criminal trespassing, illegal eviction, and theft on a property they had no legal right to inhabit. I picked up the 4 black trash bags, tossing them effortlessly into the bed of my truck. I didn't knock. I didn't yell. I got back into the driver's seat, put the truck in reverse, and drove away without looking back. The next morning, I sat in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of Cole & Associates, one of the most ruthless real estate litigation firms in Providence. Harrison Cole, a man with silver hair and eyes like a hawk, sat across from me. He had a reputation for destroying old money families in court and enjoying every second of it. I slid the metal lockbox across the mahogany table. "I need you to tell me if these are as ironclad as I think they are," I said. Harrison opened the box. He put on his reading glasses and began to review Arthur Vance's letter, the LLC documents, and the codicil. The room was silent except for the ticking of a grandfather clock and the rustle of brittle paper. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Harrison read the documents 3 times. Finally, he took off his glasses and looked at me. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. "Mrs. Vance," he began. "It's Sterling now," I corrected him. "I'll be taking my maiden name back." "Miss Sterling," Harrison amended, tapping the documents. Arthur Vance was a paranoid, brilliant bastard. These bearer certificates are perfectly valid, and the codicil is brilliantly constructed. "Do you have proof of your financial contribution to the restoration?" I reached into my leather tote and pulled out a 4-inch thick binder. It contained every bank statement, every materials receipt, every contractor invoice, and my own logged labor hours calculated at standard architectural rates. I slid it across the table. Harrison flipped through the binder, his smile widening into a grin. "Clara, they didn't just lock you out of their house. They broke into yours." "I know," I said, my voice ice cold. "So, how do we destroy them?" Harrison leaned back in his leather chair. "Well, we could file an emergency injunction today, have the police remove them by tonight. It would be swift, brutal, and entirely legal." I shook my head. "No, that's too quiet. Evelyn operates on optics. She lives for social standing. A quiet police visit allows her to spin the narrative. She'll tell everyone I went crazy and she had to call the authorities. I want it public. I want it devastating. I want her to fall from the highest possible pedestal." Harrison studied me, respect flashing in his eyes. "What do you have in mind?" "Evelyn hosts the Vance Winter Gala every year on Christmas Eve," I said, mapping out the architecture of my revenge as easily as I drafted a floor plan. "It's the biggest social event in Newport. Governors, senators, board members, they all attend. This year, she's hosting it at the newly restored Hawthorne House to formally introduce Victoria as Julian's new partner." "You want to serve them at the gala?" Harrison asked. "I don't just want to serve them," I said, leaning forward. "I want to take possession of my property in front of 300 of their closest friends." Harrison Cole stared at me for a long moment, the predatory grin returning to his face. "Miss Sterling, I have practiced law for 30 years. I have rarely met a client who understands the theater of litigation quite like you do." He drafted the paperwork that afternoon. "We didn't just prepare an eviction notice. We prepared a massive, multi-tiered legal assault. First, the quiet transfer of the LLC ownership into my name, activated by the verified receipts and Arthur's codicil. Second, a civil suit against Evelyn and Julian Vance for illegal lockout, destruction of property, my ruined sketchbooks, and back rent for the time they were occupying my house. Third, a restraining order barring them from the premises once possession was re-established. I'll have the LLC transfer expedited through the state registry by the end of the week," Harrison assured me as I stood to leave. "By Christmas Eve, you will be the absolute, undisputed owner of the Hawthorne House on paper. The Sheriff's Department will be legally obligated to enforce your right of possession." "Thank you, Harrison," I said. "I'll see you on the 24th. I spent the next month living in a modest, short-term rental near my firm. I blocked Julian's number. I blocked Evelyn's number. I ignored the divorce papers his lawyer sent to my office, forwarding them directly to Harrison with a note that simply read, "Stall." I threw myself into my work, My firm promoted me to senior project manager, a position I had earned but previously downplayed to avoid bruising Julian's fragile ego. Without the dead weight of the Vance family holding me down, I felt lighter, sharper, and utterly focused. Through the Newport grapevine, I heard exactly what was happening at the Hawthorne house. Evelyn was parading Victoria around town, bragging about the stunning restoration her son had overseen. They were throwing money at caterers, florists, and event planners for the winter gala. Julian, emboldened by my silence, was playing the role of the triumphant heir, telling anyone who would listen that I had simply buckled under the pressure of the lifestyle and walked away quietly. Let them talk, I thought, reviewing the final injunction papers Harrison had messaged me. The higher they build the tower, the harder it falls. December 24th arrived with a biting, coastal wind that whipped off the Atlantic, carrying the smell of salt and snow. The evening was crisp and clear, perfect weather for Newport's elite to gather. At 8:30 p.m., I sat in the passenger seat of a black SUV parked a block away from the Hawthorne house. Harrison sat in the driver's seat, checking his watch. In the back seat sat two uniformed officers from the Newport County Sheriff's Department. Harrison had called in a favor with the sheriff himself, explaining the highly volatile nature of serving an eviction notice during a major social event to a prominent family. The sheriff, who apparently had his own historical grievances with Evelyn's arrogance, was happy to oblige a legitimate court order. "You ready?" Harrison asked, his voice calm. I looked out the window. Down the street, the Hawthorne house was ablaze with light. I could see the glow of the chandeliers I had wired, shining through the antique windows I had reglazed. Valets were sprinting down the driveway, parking Mercedes and Bentleys. A string quartet was playing somewhere inside. It was a picture of absolute, unassailable privilege. I checked my reflection in the visor mirror. I wasn't wearing overalls tonight. I was wearing a tailored emerald green wool coat over a sharp black dress and a pair of leather boots that cost more than my first car. I looked like money. I looked like an owner. "I've been ready for 5 years," I said. Harrison put the SUV in gear. We pulled up to the main gates of the Hawthorne house. The valet tried to wave us toward the overflow parking, but Harrison rolled down his window and flashed his legal credentials. "Official court business. Keep the driveway clear," Harrison commanded. We parked directly in front of the grand portico, blocking in a silver Porsche. I stepped out of the vehicle, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. Harrison flanked my right, clutching a thick leather folio. The two deputies stepped out, hands resting casually near their belts. Their presence an immediate, undeniable shock to the arriving guests. The heavy mahogany front doors, the doors I had stripped and refinished by hand, were wide open, welcoming the elite of Rhode Island. I didn't knock. I walked straight in. The grand foyer was a sea of velvet, silk, and diamonds. Waiters maneuvered through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne. The sound of wealth, soft laughter, clinking crystal, the murmur of powerful connections filled the space. It took exactly 10 seconds for the room to notice the two uniformed deputies standing in the entryway. The laughter faltered. The music seemed to thin out. Julian was the first to see me. He was standing near the grand fireplace, holding a scotch, his arm wrapped tightly around Victoria's waist. He was wearing a custom tuxedo, looking every inch the master of the house. When his eyes locked onto mine, his smug smile collapsed. He blinked, rapidly, as if trying to clear an impossible hallucination. "Clara?" he stammered, his voice carrying awkwardly into the sudden hush of the room. Victoria looked at me, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Julian, who is this?" Before Julian could answer, Evelyn materialized from the formal dining room. She was wearing a floor-length silver gown, a diamond necklace glittering at her throat. She moved toward me with the velocity of a heat-seeking missile, her face contorted with rage. "How dare you?" Evelyn hissed, her voice a harsh, sibilant whisper designed not to carry, though the room was so quiet now that everyone within 20 feet heard her perfectly. "How dare you show your face here? You are trespassing. I told you to leave quietly, you pathetic little social climber." She turned to the deputies, her tone immediately shifting to one of aggrieved authority. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This woman is a disturbed former employee of my son. She is trespassing. Arrest her immediately and remove her from my property." The older deputy, a man with salt and pepper hair and zero tolerance for Newport drama, didn't move. He looked at Harrison. Harrison stepped forward, opening the leather folio. "Mrs. Vance, my name is Harrison Cole. I am legal counsel for Miss Clara Sterling. We are not here to arrest my client. We are here to enforce a court-ordered eviction and a transfer of possession." Evelyn laughed. It was a sharp, barking sound. "Eviction? Have you lost your mind? I own this estate. The Vance Family Trust owns this estate." "Actually, Evelyn," I said, my voice carrying clearly, echoing off the plaster ceilings I had restored. "You don't." I pulled the certified copies of the documents from Harrison's folio. "Arthur was a very thorough man," I continued, taking a step closer to her. The guests nearest to us were physically leaning in, completely captivated by the unfolding disaster. "He knew you were draining the family trust. So, before he died, he transferred the Hawthorne House deed to a blind LLC, and he attached a codicil." Evelyn's face lost all color. The name Arthur hit her like a physical blow. "That's a lie," she breathed. "Arthur would never. He stipulated that whoever restored this property with their own personal funds would take absolute ownership of the LLC," I said, holding up the state registry transfer. "I have the receipts, Evelyn. $150,000 of my own money, 5 years of my labor. The state of Rhode Island has reviewed the documents, the receipts, and Arthur's codicil. The transfer was finalized on Tuesday." I handed her the first document. "This is the deed transfer, naming me as the sole owner of the Hawthorne House." Julian dropped his scotch glass. It shattered on the hardwood floor, a sharp, violent crash in the silent room. "Clara, what did you do?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't do anything, Julian," I said, not looking at him. I kept my eyes locked on Evelyn. "Your father did. I just found the safe you were too lazy to look for." I handed Evelyn the second document. "This is an emergency injunction and eviction notice, signed by a superior court judge this morning. You, Julian, and Victoria are occupying my property illegally." Evelyn was staring at the paperwork, her hands shaking so violently the pages rattled. "This is fraud. This is a forgery. I will tie you up in litigation for the next 20 years, she screamed, all pretense of aristocratic composure vanishing. She sounded desperate, shrill, and terrified. "You can try," Harrison interjected smoothly, "but as of this exact moment, you are legally trespassing on my client's property, and you have exactly 30 minutes to vacate the premises before the deputies forcibly remove you." "Vacate," Julian choked out, stepping forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Clara, please. Victoria is pregnant. This is our home. You can't do this. Not tonight, not in front of everyone." I finally turned to look at my husband, the man I had loved, the man who had packed my wedding dress into a trash bag and left it in the freezing rain. "You're right, Julian," I said, my voice steady, devoid of any anger or sorrow. "Victoria is pregnant, which is why I suggest you start packing quickly. It's cold outside." I turned to the room at large. 300 of Newport's most influential citizens were watching, eyes wide, champagne glasses forgotten. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice ringing out with absolute authority, "I apologize for the interruption. The Hawthorne House is now under new ownership. The party is officially over. Please make your way to the exits. The valets are bringing your cars around now." For a second, nobody moved. Then, the governor of Rhode Island, who had been standing near the stairs, set his glass down on a side table, adjusted his coat, and walked toward the door. That broke the spell. Like a dam bursting, the guests began to stream toward the coat check. There were whispers, shocked gasps, and the undeniable thrill of witnessing the total, public destruction of the Vance family reputation. Evelyn tried to stop them. She grabbed the arm of a prominent bank executive. "Richard, don't leave. This is a misunderstanding. This girl is insane." Richard gently but firmly removed her hand from his sleeve. "I think it's best we go, Evelyn. Call me when you sort this out." He didn't look back. Within 15 minutes, the grand foyer was empty of guests. The caterers were quietly packing up their trays, desperate to escape the blast radius. Only Evelyn, Julian, Victoria, Harrison, the deputies, and I remained. Victoria was crying hysterically, clutching her designer clutch against her stomach. "Julian, do something. Where are we supposed to go?" Julian looked like a cornered animal. He looked at his mother, expecting her to conjure a miracle, but Evelyn was staring at the floor, clutching Arthur's letter, her breathing shallow and ragged. The armor was gone. She was just an old, spiteful woman standing in a house she no longer controlled. 30 minutes is up," the older deputy said, stepping forward, his hand resting on his radio. "Mr. Vance, Mrs. Vance, I suggest you gather whatever personal items you can carry and exit the property. If you need to arrange for a moving company to collect the rest of your belongings, you can coordinate that through Miss Sterling's attorney next week. You can't do this to me, Evelyn whispered, looking up at me, her eyes filled with a venomous, impotent hatred. I am Evelyn Vance. This is my city. Not anymore, I said. I watched them pack. They were allowed one suitcase each. Julian threw designer suits into a duffel bag, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't operate the zipper. Victoria sobbed the entire time, demanding Julian call a hotel. Evelyn moved like a ghost, packing a small bag of jewelry and cosmetics, refusing to look at me. As they walked out the front door, the freezing wind whipping around them, Julian turned back one last time. Clara, he pleaded, tears streaming down his face. Please, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Let's just talk about this. I reached out and grasped the heavy brass handle of the front door. Julian, I said, looking at the man I had once thought was my future. Your services as a placeholder are no longer required. I slammed the door shut. The sound echoed through the massive, empty house. I locked the deadbolt. I leaned my forehead against the cool, solid wood of the door. The deputies had escorted them off the property and were waiting at the end of the driveway to ensure they didn't return. Harrison had gone to the kitchen to deal with the caterers. I was alone. I walked slowly through the grand foyer, my heels clicking on the hardwood. I walked past the sweeping staircase, running my hand along the polished mahogany banister I had sanded by hand. I walked into the dining room, where the remnants of their ruined gala sat on the long table. It was over. The 5 years of gaslighting, of exhaustion, of being treated like a disposable asset. I had survived them, and I had outsmarted them. The fallout over the next 6 months was spectacular. Evelyn Vance became a social pariah. In Newport, you can be eccentric, you can be cruel, but you cannot be publicly humiliated and exposed as a fraud. Her friends stopped returning her calls. She was quietly asked to step down from the hospital board. The revelation that she had drained the family trust, combined with the loss of the Hawthorne house, decimated her finances. She was forced to sell her oceanfront estate to cover her debts and moved into a modest condo in a neighboring town. Julian's life unraveled with equal speed. Victoria, realizing that Julian was no longer the heir to a massive fortune and was, in fact, facing severe financial difficulties, broke off the engagement 2 months later. She moved back to her family's estate, taking her trust fund with her. Julian tried to keep his job at the boutique investment firm, but the scandal was too toxic. He was let go to pursue other opportunities. The divorce was finalized quickly. Without Evelyn's money to fund a protracted legal battle, Julian's lawyer advised him to accept the settlement I offered, which was essentially me walking away with the house and him walking away with his clothes. I didn't stay in the Hawthorne house. As much as I loved the architecture, it was saturated with memories I wanted to leave behind. 6 months after the Christmas Eve gala, I put the estate on the market. It sold in 3 days for $4.2 million in an all-cash deal to a tech executive from Boston who appreciated historical preservation. I took the $4.2 million and did exactly what Evelyn said I could never do. I started my own architectural preservation firm. I bought a small, beautiful mid-century modern house on a quiet cul-de-sac, far away from the Newport mansions. I hired a team of talented young architects, many of them women who had been told they were better suited for interior design by the old guard. We take on complex, challenging restorations. We build things that last. Last week, I received a letter in the mail. The return address was Julian's. I didn't open it. I didn't need to know if he was apologizing or begging or trying to explain. I walked over to the paper shredder in my home office, fed the envelope into the slot, and listened to the satisfying sound of the paper being destroyed. I looked around my office. My drafting table was covered in blueprints for a new commercial project. My firm's logo was etched on the glass door. The sun was streaming through the windows, warm and bright. I thought about the 4 black trash bags sitting in the freezing rain. I thought about the heavy iron safe in the basement. I thought about Arthur Vance, a man I had never met, who had reached out from the grave to hand me a weapon, knowing I would be the only one brave enough to use it. They tried to throw me away. They tried to lock me out of my own life. But they forgot that I'm a builder. When you lock a builder out of a house, they don't cry on the porch. They find the structural weakness. They tear down the foundation. And then, they build something entirely new on the ruins.